So I've been live streaming my meme series on this channel for a few months now, and I wanted to take this video to go over a model that I believe I alluded to in a previous stream. Let's get to that. For other diseases, you can also use it to model other population trends. There was an interesting model I want to investigate at some point involving China's infamous one birth policy, where if you have men and women who can only give birth to one, a man-woman pair only giving birth to one child, and the social dynamics of that, and how that will affect the overall population. Can you model the trend of what the overall Chinese population is going to be? I think that's an interesting question that I do want to probably make a separate video about at some point in the near future. So, one of the key ideas is that this problem can be modeled using a compartment model, or as a PDE in the appropriate limit. Well, here it is, China's one-child policy. Populations are usually taught as a first example of a differential equation by using the basic linear equation P prime equals RP, where R is a birth rate. And this idea is still basically true. But here we get to add a number of extra caveats to such a model, and we get some results that suggest quite a bit about the effects that this policy has had on China, even a decade after it was relaxed, where for all intents and purposes, it's almost as if the policy has never been lifted. Now let's begin by setting up our core variables. We'll denote the number of females and males in the population as X and Y, respectively, based on the sex chromosomes. One unit of X or Y represents 1 million people, which is crazy considering that most countries would have a resolution an order of magnitude or two smaller. China is huge. A funny rule of thumb I heard for events in China is to take the number you might expect and slap an extra 0 or 2 on the end. So instead of a headline saying, "Bar fight sends 2 men to the hospital," it'll say, "Hospital surged with 200 patients after a bar fight." For context, the 5 deadliest conflicts in human history are World War II, the Mongol invasion starting with Genghis Khan, the Three Kingdoms era, the Taiping Rebellion, and the Manchu conquest of China. Depending on how much damage the Mongolians did, that is 3 to 3.5 of the deadliest conflicts in human history, all happening in China. It is huge. Another important facet of this story is the role of sex selection, which we denote with parameter A. Biologically, A is about 0.51, meaning 51% of births are male. But during China's one-child policy, this ratio skewed unnaturally high, with values reaching as high as 0.57. There are a number of cultural and economic reasons for this, but this will drive the observed large separation between the male and female populations. A large population of single men, especially those who are young and have no opportunities, are a security asset for whoever controls them. There have been continuing concerns about how this population might erupt in violence, either in revolution against China or on the offensive against another country, even one the size of India. Another big sex-related assumption that we make is that reproduction is driven linearly by the number of women, since they are a limiting factor. Using the law of mass action, which I explained in my lecture on compartment models, a single woman produces either a boy or a girl with ratio A, with men as a catalyst for such reaction. We compute a baseline birth rate by assuming that each woman has an average of 2.5 children over her reproductive years, ages 22 to 41. We also assume that women who had children before the policy was enacted were permitted to have one more child after. While this is not actually the case, there were enough other exceptions to the policy that I have not accounted for that I will use this as a partial proxy for those, which if I were to model accurately would be too large an undertaking for such a short video like this. To model the population by both age and sex, we define 2 functions, x and y, over the different ages s at time t. Now, people age at a rate of 1 year per year, so changes over time require the use of the chain rule to account for both the change in time and the change in age. Use of the chain rule like this came up in my meme lecture about different time derivatives, which explain how a quantity changes in time while accounting for many other background variables that also change in time. Mortality rates are age-dependent and modeled exponentially, starting out with a small proportion of deaths that slowly ramps up over a lifetime, with men dying faster than women. Now, this does not technically consider infant mortality, but that happens on a timescale too small to resolve for this model, and is accounted for in the birth rate. Initial conditions are taken from the 1979 population data.
This data came in 5-year age brackets, so we linearly interpolated it to get 1-year age classes. To compute the births, we first define a maternity kernel K of S, which give birth rates by female age. Then, total birth rates at time t are computed as an integral, summing up all the women who give birth in a year. As an aside, I originally had a bilinear birth kernel that counted for both men and women, where if there were a lot more women than men, we would expect to see a lower birth rate. However, this assumes a symmetry in reproductive function in both men and women that simply does not accord with reality. This only became apparent when I was having difficulty in testing this model, which demonstrated that something simpler, like ignoring the population of men, might work better. I mention this as a good example of how testing and iteration are an important factor in any modeling endeavor. In the show notes, I have a GitHub link to the codes that I used to generate the upcoming figures, and you will likely see the remnants of this model. Combining the special time derivative and age-based mortality, we arrive at the McKendrick-von Forster equations for age-structured population dynamics, which basically says that the change of population over time is only the losses due to deaths. This gives us the dynamics equations for both men and women, which are the first two that we see on this slide. This is what drives the bulk of activity, but it needs more people to continue into the future. Newborns enter the population at age 0, which produces an interesting boundary condition. Now in this model, B of t depends upon y, so this boundary condition is probably the most interesting aspect of this system in a formal PDE analysis. However, in practice, the integral is really easy to compute in this model via a simple sum. This is our baseline model. To enforce the one-child policy, we include a term that removes mothers from the reproductive population using that above maternity kernel. In order to track the whole population, we introduce a new PDE to track the aging of the mothers, which looks the same as the female equation, but the red term has a positive sign, since it is on the receiving end of maternity, and the boundary condition is trivial. In practice, there are a number of awesome ways to take this PDE and discretize it in a normal fashion. However, the most natural resolution for both the age and time is a year. Treating this problem as a normal compartment model with this scaling, each compartment is a population of a particular age, and having a yearly time step trivializes the aging process. We let x sub t and y sub t be vectors, with the ith entry being the population of age I in year t. The initial data was interpolated to artificially increase the resolution to match the model. We let k be the matrix modeling maternity at each age, and we let s be a shift operator that handles the aging, and mx and my be the mortality matrices, which computes the death rates at different ages. You can adjust the m values to integrate over the mortality of a year, or just estimate it by using a Riemann sunlight at a single point like I did. Newborns are again inserted at age 0, but now, instead of an integral, we use a sum, calculated here via a dot product, and this gives us a fully discretized simulation of the policy. Now it's important to realize that I used a PDE model to derive a compartment model, but one could have just as easily done the derivation in reverse. I went the direction of PDE to compartment model as I did to highlight connections to previous meme lectures in terms of the roles that different aspects of differential equations can play in a model. Now before we get to the model predictions, this is the official population data gathered from populationpyramid.net. This slide shows two plots. The left shows the actual age distribution over time, and the right shows the total population, including projected growth, shown as the data beyond the green line. The dotted lines in red and blue show when the male and female populations peaked. The pixelation we see on the left is a consequence of a 5-year bucketing, and I hope this can justify the linear interpolation of the population to a 1-year resolution. Plus, the interpolated resolution will capture the characteristic curves of a hyperbolic equation like this. For the commenters who have asked about it, I will probably talk about the hyperbolic, elliptic, and parabolic classification in my next meme lecture, so make sure to subscribe so you don't miss that. Ultimately, this is a control for the various models we'll look at. In the left population pyramid plots, we notice the double dark stripes. Those capture two booms in the population in the 70s and the 90s. Those features are something we are interested in. We can literally see the average age being dragged up by those peaks. First, we model what would have happened without the one-child policy, and you should not be surprised with the rapid population growth. This is actual exponential growth with extra steps. Both the total population and age structure show immense growth, diverging significantly from official data, threatening a population of 2 billion. It was graphs like this that probably scared the Chinese government into such a policy in the first place, especially since many of them had probably seen the effects of the Great Chinese Famine, which casually killed 15 to 55 million people. As another aside about exponential growth, if you see a video or tweet where something is claimed to be growing exponentially, please share it with me, either in the comments or tag me on Twitter. I've seen a lot of people use that word for things that do not grow exponentially, and I kind of want to make a video about that, but it's a hard thing to research. Anyway, next we impose the idealized one-child policy with immediate, perfect compliance. And the result is pretty obvious. Growth slows drastically almost immediately. The population flattens and even declines in later years. However, this is too sharp a transition compared to observed data. This ideal model does not match reality, saying that the Chinese population topped out at about 1.2 billion around 2010, rather than closer to 1.4 billion a decade later, and it would imply a systematic overcounting from day one. China's large population is one of its biggest assets because it implies economic and military power that it can throw around, so I am open to the possibility that some overcounting is happening. But an overcount on the order of 200 million people is too bold. That population alone would make it the 8th largest country in the world, in between Bangladesh and Brazil. Some researchers, such as Yi Fuxian, claims that China has overcounted its population by as much as 130 million people, and that it peaked earlier than otherwise claims. If my model is suggesting an undercount far beyond even the strongest critics of the policy, I have to throw it out. It's just too unbelievable. So the obvious question is, what causes this difference? The model assumed perfect enforcement, but in practice, the policy and reality carved out many exceptions. 1. Rural families could have a second child if the first was a girl. 2nd, ethnic minorities were exempt if their populations were too small. 3rd, enforcement varied across regions. Regardless of all this, though, over time many families would start limiting themselves to only one child because of social norms and incentives, such as the cost of childcare and an expectation of working women. Even today, a decade after the policy was expanded to 2, and now 3 children, the fertility rate has improved so poorly to basically assume that the bulk of the population is still operating under the one-child policy. I think this is happening in large part because of these norms and incentives. In an effort to try and capture these various effects, we model this by delaying enforcement of the one-child policy. The following models assume that the one-child policy just started perfectly after a certain number of years into the future, though one could also model this using a ramp-up. The following slides examine some cases of delayed enforcement. Our first adjusted model delays enforcement by a mere 5 years. It does a little better than the perfect model, but it does not come close enough to the official data to consider it true. Next, we consider a 10-year delay. Now, this version matches the official data fairly closely until about the year 2000. However, it still suggests that the official numbers overcount the present population by about 80 million people. This missing 80 million people would make it the 20th largest country in the world, between France and Germany, but it is no longer the most outrageous estimate compared to that 130 million mentioned earlier. One thing I think is revelatory is that the divergence of this model and the actual populations happens in the year 2000, because 2000 is right when the first generation of single children would start having children of their own, and the long-term effects of the policy would really start to kick in. Finally, we consider a model where the policy was delayed by 15 years. This results in such an overgrowth compared to the official numbers that it cannot be believed. The Chinese government has no incentive to undercount their population like that. In conclusion, we consider 3 different delays. A 5-year delay does very little. It's almost the same as no policy change. A 15-year delay is too late, unless we assume some major data underreporting, and again there are no incentives for that. A 10-year delay fits full until around the year 2000, but suggests an overaccount by roughly 80 million people. I am not married to these numbers, but right now, if I had to place a wager on past and current undercounts, I would use this model as a starting point. As a reminder, I am just a simple mathematician who wanted to model an interesting variant of an otherwise basic population model as a thought exercise. I have no evidence of the Chinese government cooking the books, nor would I be a valid judge of such evidence. That being said, I agree with most of the criticisms of this policy. The policy's very limitations on family size violates what I consider a fundamental human right to marriage and family size, and the proliferation of abortion and infanticide, often forced, often sex-selective, and often in occurrence, is appalling. In the show notes, you can find the codes and the datasets that I use to conduct this analysis. If you take this code and find anything interesting with it, like a parameter set or a variation of policy enforcement that better captures the official data, please let me know. If you like this video, then like this video. Subscribe for more, and thank you for watching.